You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Please join us at the Open Door. We discuss solidarity, subsidiarity, economic democracy, and nonviolence in light of Catholic social teaching. We explore how to move from discussion to political change. Culture and politics, to be sure, are interwoven, so we care deeply about education and the arts. Our questions often lead us to report on the projects and promise of the American Solidarity Party.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today, we'll talk about the work of State Catholic Conference directors. Our focus will be on the role that they can play in developing Catholic education. Our welcome guest is Tom Venzor. He has served as the executive director of the Nebraska Catholic Conference since 2016. Prior to this, he served as the associate director for Pro-Life and Family for the Nebraska Catholic Conference. Before joining the NCC, Tom worked as a legislative aide in the Nebraska State Legislature, as well as in various capacities throughout several other legislative sessions. Tom earned his undergraduate degree in political science, philosophy, and religious studies from Doane College in Crete, his master's degree in philosophy from Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and his law degree from the University of Nebraska College of Law. Tom and his wife Makayla have 4 children at home: Monica, Claire, Anthony, and Julia. And they have a little one in heaven, Thérèse. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Let's start, Tom, with an encouraging breakthrough, and then we can move to context. The Nebraska State Legislature recently passed school choice legislation. Could you tell us some of the particulars of this legislation and what led to the victory?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. Very excited to be with you all and to talk about these topics of state Catholic conferences and the work that we do, particularly in the area of education. This last year and the year before it, we had 2 major breakthroughs on the school choice issue where we were able to pass school choice legislation. The Nebraska Catholic Conference has been working on the issue of school choice for decades. We've been around since the late 60s and probably have been working on some form of school choice to help parents be able to educate their children in the way they think is best for their child. Probably been working on that since the beginning of our existence, but definitely for decades. We had a major breakthrough this last session, and including the session before with passing school choice legislation. Last year, we were able to pass LB 753, which was a scholarship tax credit bill that provides basically scholarships through a public policy mechanism of providing state income tax credits to contributors who provide a portion of their state tax liability over to scholarship granting organizations that then distribute scholarships to children. What we passed this last year was LB 14, or what we passed this year, just a couple months ago, was LB 1402. And this would provide $10 million in scholarship funding through the State Treasurer's Office of Nebraska. And the State Treasurer would then distribute scholarships to children across the state who are looking to attend a non-public school. LB 1402 is very much focused in the tradition of our Catholic social teaching on preferential option for the poor. So it very much is targeted to our low-income families who are across the state who don't otherwise have the financial means to choose an educational setting that is best for them. And that's so it's really important, one, that we support parents and their ability to choose an education that's best for them, but with a particular focus on those low-income families who lack the financial means to be able to make that educational choice in their everyday life. And so that bill really focuses on those families. But that's the nuts and bolts of it. It's state appropriation of funding to the state treasurer to families who are in need so that those children can go to a non-public school or can also continue to go to a non-public school like our Catholic schools here in Nebraska. So huge victory. We had been working on those two pieces of legislation for probably 10, 20 years. And it's just been a labor of love to help our state legislators understand what this legislation is and why it's important. And it's taken us years of working against a lot of strong opposition on those topics and helping people understand a lot of the myths that are spoken about school choice and what the realities are about school choice, including how our Catholic education system runs here in Nebraska. So huge victories, very grateful, very thankful to God. And even though our opponents are trying to take both of those bills to ballot referendums and get them repealed, we are nevertheless thrilled and joyful for those victories because it says a lot about our state legislature and the importance of kids and families and making sure that kids get the best education they can, because we all know that you get your K through 12 education one time and we need to do it well so that those kids can succeed into the future.
Great context, Tom. Now, let me clarify this. The money that comes from the state goes not to Catholic schools, but to parents.
Yeah, correct. Yep. And so in Nebraska, we actually have a state constitutional amendment that prohibits direct appropriations of the state to our non-public schools. So we've been dealing with that for years. That's been in our state constitution for some time. It's basically a form of a Blaine Amendment. And the Blaine Amendments have just their own problematic history and past of anti-Catholic bigotry. But yeah, in Nebraska, direct appropriations cannot go to non-public schools. And this is definitely a program, LB 1402 and LB 753, our scholarship tax credit bill from last year. Both of those are programs that provide funding to families and to students so that they can choose an educational setting that's best for them.
Excellent, excellent. Mario.
Well, how is it that this legislation is not undermining the public education itself?
Yeah, so one thing that often people are concerned about or they raise as an issue is, hey, well, won't this legislation affect our public schools or our public school funding, and won't it hurt them? And, we've heard this. This is probably one of the main concerns that's usually raised on school choice legislation. And it's an important question because everybody, of course, wants to ensure that there's a strong public school systems, that they're getting adequate funding to take care of a number of kids that obviously go to public school systems. For the Catholic Conference, for the bishops here in Nebraska, so we have 3 bishops here in Nebraska that make up the Nebraska Catholic Conference. They, of course, we want, public school systems to thrive and succeed. We know that there's many kids in those systems, and those kids, all kids deserve a strong, educational opportunity. So for us, it's never been a matter of competition, of trying to show that we're better or try to get money from them or anything of that nature. It's really ensuring that everybody has an opportunity for a good education in a setting that's best for them. So here's what we say on that theme, which is these legislative bills related to school choice don't do anything to affect the overall education funding formula in Nebraska. In Nebraska, like in many other states, there is a unique education funding formula. Here it's called TIOSA, which is an acronym for some longer thing that doesn't matter at this point. But in Nebraska, TIOSA is not affected by school choice programs. those schools are going to continue to receive the funding that they need for the students that they are educating. And so I think that's really important to remember when we're doing legislation like school choice policy. And not only that, when you compare the amount of money that has gone into these school choice programs. So last year's bill, LB 753, the scholarship tax credit bill, that allows up to $25 million in state income tax credits to be given out. And then with this year's legislation that was passed, LB 1402, that provides $10 million in state funding. So again, when you're talking about LB 1402, when you compare that, that is 0.2% of the annual state funding for public education, which in Nebraska, that's $5 billion. So $10 million is not taking away money from public schools. And if anything, it's a small sliver of the amount of money and the investments that are made into public schools here in Nebraska. And in fact, in these last couple years, our state legislature and our governor have made significant investments and increases in state funding for public schools. And so that's important to recognize. And so when you compare this in contrast to the overall state budget for education spending, or even when you compare it to some of our larger school systems, this provides, 1% of even some of our larger school systems, overall budgets and fundings, or this is less amount of money than some school systems spend on things like transportation. So again, this is a very small amount of money, but it's an amount of money that can make a huge impact for the families that need it, right? A family who can get $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000 scholarship to attend a school of their choice, and it changes the overall trajectory of their life. It gets them to graduation. It gets them into a college. It helps get them set on their journey in life. It forms them in their faith. I mean, the impacts of school choice are just, the data's out there, and it's pretty clear that these are programs that are win-win-win. They're a win for the state. They're a win for the family. They're a win for the kid. They're a win for the public school system as well, as the data shows. So these programs strengthen everybody everywhere. And so we're very proud of them in what they do, not only to strengthen our non-public schools and our non-public school families, but also our public schools and our public school families.
A quick follow-up along the lines of compare and contrast. Here in California, the public schools budget is key to the number of students in the school. And so if N number of students aren't in the school, but are in parochial schools, the budget correspondingly goes down. Is that comparable to what you folks in Nebraska have, or is it a different structure that we have here in California?
So it's fairly similar, but like with our education funding formula, even when a student leaves a local public school district, there's a couple years of that school being held harmless, so they continue to have the education funding for that student, even if the student isn't in the school. And so that gives them time, obviously, to adapt, and to adjust, maybe for a decrease of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 students. But also it's important to recognize that they continue to, hold, things like local property taxes that help fund that local public school. Even if the student leaves, they continue to retain, things like local property taxes to help fund the school. And again, when you look at the schools and in the amount of what are called fixed cost or variable costs, so when a kid stays or leaves, there are certain costs that are associated with the student. Again, the schools are going to continue to have the funding to provide a broader education for the kids that they're educating, including some of that hold harmless money that they will have. And so, and not only that, but then we also think about in Nebraska, there's about 40,000 students in non-public schools. So if you take that times, $15,000 a student, which is roughly the cost to educate a child in Nebraska in a public school, non-public school students and families are saving the state over $500 million per year. So when we want to talk about cost savings or whether this hurts or doesn't hurt, we also have to remember in that conversation how much non-public school families are already saving the state on a day-to-day basis. So over $500 million. If non-public schools shut down tomorrow morning, the state would be on the hook for over $500 million more in educational expenses. So again, these programs are very important because they provide a cost savings to the state, and that's also pretty clear in the data, in the evidence that school choice programs provide a cost savings to the state. And that's not just data from third parties who are school choice advocates. That comes from places like state departments of revenue who have done studies on their programs where they recognize that a state program is saving taxpayer dollars, $1.60 to $1.70 for every dollar that's invested into the program. So again, you're getting a return on the investment. And we've always argued if you're getting a return on the investment, there's no reason that return on investment can't be reinvested in things like public education so that additional dollars can go help fund that, or they can go help fund any other number of important state projects that are deemed important by the state legislature. So again, they save the state money, and that money can be reinvested in things like education or other important aspects of the state.
Now, I know Valerie wants to pursue this question, but I have a follow-up on the follow-up.
You bet.
And it's a kind of a blunt follow-up on the follow-up. Something like this. If, in fact, you in the state system will have fewer students, why should you have the same amount of money? Why shouldn't you have less money if you have fewer students? Is that missing something obvious?
Well, no, not at all. And I think that's already how the system works today, right? If a family didn't get a school choice scholarship or decided to go to a different public school, or the family decided to homeschool, that public school would have to figure out how to adjust for that change in enrollment. Sometimes their enrollment goes up, sometimes their enrollment goes down, and they have to budget and act accordingly. I mean, that's what we all do. If a kid leaves, home for college, we now start adjusting our budget and those kind of things. I mean, that's just something that everybody needs to be doing, period. It's just common sense, financing and budgeting. And so basically, yeah, I mean, they have a responsibility to figure out how to budget given the number of kids that they have. But I think here's an underlying premise in everything that we're talking about. And this is something I've learned over the years in watching the school choice debate play out, is that there's a real fundamental philosophical, principled argument going on underneath all of it. And it's this question of, to whom does the kid belong? To whom does the student belong? And our position is that it's the parent who's the primary educator of that child, and it's the parent who has the right and the responsibility of directing that child's education in a way that is best for them. And it's the school systems, whether it's a public school or a non-public school, those school systems are there to assist the parents in the education of that child. They're not there to displace or to replace the parents. And I think that there's a lot of people who are opponents of school choice who miss or forget the fact that the parents are the primary educators, and the parents need to be empowered with the ability to choose an education that's best for that child. And they often think, because of that it's the state who is sort of primarily responsible for the education of that child, or it's the public school system that sort of has a right primarily to educate that child. And that's just not true. That's just a misunderstanding of fundamental principles and first principles when it comes to parental rights in the education of a child. So we always have to ask the question, so if there's this idea that this student belongs to my school and I'm owed money because that student, assumedly belongs to my school, no, that's wrong. That student belongs to the parent, and it's the parent who directs the education of that child. And it's the school system that adopts and improvises and what have you to the decisions of parents to educate, to have their child's education directed in the way that they think is proper and fit. So I think that's important, right? And that's a philosophical point, right? That's an even theological point. that underlies, I think, this whole debate about school choice. And if you get that first principle wrong, then you're going to get your policy decisions wrong on this issue. If you get them right, then you're going to make right policy decisions, which is what we've been doing these last 2 years in Nebraska. We've gotten the principle right, and now we're getting the policy right.
Excellent. Valerie.
Thank you. I have a faith sharing group with a lady, a dear Catholic friend of mine who teaches in the public school. She teaches third grade. And I am curious, seeing that we're not pitting against, but as Catholics who are concerned about the common good and the most vulnerable, we can recognize that there are a lot of vulnerable kids that are in the public schools. Is there something that the Catholic Conference does to promote specifically reform within public school or adequate resourcing? I know that, like, for example, she could really, like, there's the number of the ratio of students to teachers, the lack of assistance, particularly with kids who may be mainstreamed and are particularly difficult to manage in a classroom setting. These are things that I think we should be concerned about as well. Do you address that as a conference, or?
Yeah, so for example, in the last few years, some things that we've been very supportive of that help all of our schools and all of our people going into our schools would be things like teacher recruitment, teacher retention. We've assisted on legislation that helps with teacher training, career readiness to teach, attracting individuals to the teaching profession, ensuring that once we have them there, we're providing them like things like teacher retention payments and things of that nature. So again, that's a shared concern that we all have, and that helps public schools, non-public schools, et cetera. And so that's been something very important that we've worked on recently. We've worked on legislation regarding public safety funding to ensure that all of our schools have the adequate resources they need to have safe settings for students. Every kid should be safe no matter what their educational setting is. And so that's been a big thing. Another thing, too, has been that in Nebraska, we provided substantial increases to our special education funding at the state level. Unfortunately, we had a pretty low level of funding in Nebraska for special education, which meant that our public schools were really falling short in the resources they need to help provide services to kids in their schools and services to kids in non-public schools, because they have a legal right to provide services to those children also. But basically ensuring that we have adequate funding going into that area. So we went from providing 40% of special education funding to 80% of special education funding. And then we created some other pools of money for situations where a school might end up having a very high need student at a time that they weren't expecting that student, to ensure that they were sort of getting reimbursement and payment for a student who might have high needs that they hadn't anticipated in their budget, for example. And so we have worked on those types of legislative bills to help ensure that we're helping education not only in the non-public school setting, but obviously in the public school setting as well. Because as you said, Valerie, this is an issue. This is an issue of the common good, and it's not just simply looking after our own special interest or anything of that nature. It's how can we help the common good. And one other point I want to make. You didn't ask this, but I think as you talked about your friend in your faith sharing group who teaches in a public school, something that we've found, as I've been working on this for 10 years and talking with others who do school choice next to me, is that when it comes to the teachers, and oftentimes even maybe the building administrator of a school, but oftentimes the teacher, when you talk to them about school choice, whether public school, non-public school, they don't sort of have an ideological position on school choice. They just want that kid to get an education that's best for that child, whether it's in a public school setting or a non-public school setting or a homeschool setting. They just want to make sure that kid thrives. And I think that's really important, right? When we think of the person who is there every day next to that kid, working with them, trying to get them to excel in reading and math and science and, what have you. They just want that kid to be in a setting that's best for them. If that's in their classroom, great. If that's in another classroom at a different school, great. And so I think that's really important to remember, because oftentimes the opponents for school choice that we're dealing with I think they forget that vision, that down to earth, everyday experience with the kid. What's best for Johnny or Susie? What do they need? Where do they need to go? And often I found that boots on the ground teachers are sort of like, hey, if they're doing better, if they would do better in the public school, great. If they would do better across the street in the non-public school, great. Let's help them get to the school that's best for them. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And we share that sense of the common good and that vision for the common good, which is beautiful.
Thank you, Tom.
So Tom, where does the ideology come from if it's not the teacher in the classroom?
Well, I think the ideology just comes from being too caught up in one's, particular special interests, and that happens in any number of, industries or categories or lobbying groups. And I don't want to put that, I don't want to make that totally negative thing, right? Because we all have an interest to represent, and it's important to represent that interest so that interest can have a voice at the state legislature. But sometimes in advocating in that way, you lose sight of the broader good, the common good, some of the bigger things that go outside of your own purview or interest. And so I think it's always important to remember and take that step back and say, what is this legislation doing? And even if it might, cut against my own special interest, the fact of the matter is that it might be good for the broader community to have this thing. And that's I think a place of sacrifice, or what we would call Christian charity. Right, that this is something, or even a sense of justice, that this thing is owed to another. And so I think, having those values, sort of always checking our own particular interests or ideology or tribalism or political party interests or what have you, I think that's very key. And that's what we do as Catholics constantly, is we try to rise above those things and rise above those to the transcendentals and rise into the great virtues that should guide our society. And so that's what I think we're constantly trying to do, I think, at the Catholic Conference, and helping people to have also that vision for the common good and for humanity in mind when they're making these kind of decisions.
Two more add-ons, and then it's Mario who's up. Add-on number one. Earlier on, your description of the funding process suggests that it doesn't need to be seen as a zero-sum game anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And add-on number two, where does the ideology come from? I suppose you could make a case that it really comes from someone like, Thomas Dewey. And what we have there... John Dewey, sorry. It's Thomas Venzor. John Dewey. At any rate, Dewey, of course, took a very dim view of Christian principles. And as a pragmatist, he wouldn't be interested in first principles in the first place, right? So I think that spirit continues to permeate American education. All right, Mario, your turn, and thanks for the correction there.
Yeah, I don't want to be confused with John Dewey.
Let's see, it was Huey, Dewey, and Louie.
There we go.
Those are cartoon characters.
You can put me in that group instead.
Right.
Well, but if I heard well, you are saying that we need to worry about the well-being of the kids and how they succeed and how they achieve their own good and all these beautiful things. But when you are expressing that, you are expressing from a very particular view of the good, which is not shared by at least 75-80% of the American people. I don't think American people know what a common good is. I don't think Catholics know what a common good is. They may talk about general interest, but that's not the common good. Even among Thomas, we discuss about the common good. So, and the good is completely gone. So I put myself into the mind on someone who doesn't share these views and say, hey, how dare you are claiming that there is a supposedly objective view of the good when I don't even believe in that good. I'm a John Dewey follower or whatever view you may have. So we are dealing with an issue which is crucial, and I don't think we have a solution, which is the issue of democracy. Pluralism makes our views incommensurable, and there's no way that we can reach to any agreement. The only agreement is power. We have more votes than the others. That's it, which leads us to the philosophical issue of democracy itself. Now, my point of this run is precisely that. We can claim that this is objective, which I believe it is, but the rest of the population doesn't even grasp that. And what I'm saying, even Catholics don't know about that. And that is a problem, and I think is a problem for the Catholic bishops. What is your reaction to that rant?
Yeah, those are all wonderful and important, and as you well know, very complex questions. I would respond, I think, with a few points. When we're dealing with the state legislature, we recognize that we're dealing with a variety of people with a variety of belief systems that may or may not mesh with our Catholic social thinking and our Catholic worldview. And to be more clear, with objective truth and the principles of justice or charity or hope or what have you. And so then, what we do as, essentially lobbyists is to work with state legislators and try to identify what are the things that interest them and how can we perhaps build common ground on those interests. So with a very devout Catholic legislator, we can talk about the first principles of the common good and parental rights, etc. But if I talk with another legislator who doesn't share those values, what I can begin my discussion with them might be something like, hey, children in your particular legislative district are having very difficult times with academic performance. And we know from the data that something like school choice, for example, can help achieve higher academic performance. And here's the data. Here's how we can show you through the studies that this program can help kids in your neighborhood achieve higher academic performance and graduate high school and have a better chance for a good job and a good family, and hopefully be contributors, to broader society. And then we can find a shared interest that helps us get to a place where it's not simply about, can I use power to force them to get to my position, but can I find a place of common ground where we can build together toward a common goal and a common desire. And so in that respect, I would say that even if somebody doesn't totally agree with us on our full view of the common good, there are certain aspects of the common good that we understand and that we share. And while we might not use the same terminology to describe those things, we can still, I think, achieve common interests that I think we as Catholics know are part and parcel to the common good and to good objective order of society, in the right ordering of family and children, etc. And so I think that's important for us. So we have the work of, I think, catechesis and evangelization. And as we all know, when we do that kind of work, we're trying to find out where's the person in front of me? Where are they at? And based on where they are at, how can I work with them to draw them in, hopefully, to deeper and more beautiful truths, so that we can promote something that is good and beautiful and just and, all those other things.
But let me follow up. But you're already saying that we quit public education. In other words, public education is beyond reform. You need a different type of school and be funded by public money in order for your kid to be better off. In other words, wouldn't then the church be also focused on how we re-energize public education? Because public education seems to me just is all on the hands of John Dewey followers and so all that. So generally what we are saying is that, well, the public square is not ours. We need some ghettos here and there be funded with public money and add to that the homeschooling, but the public square is lost. Why then we don't start the evangelization process so that we can have Catholic teachers in the public school? That's my point. Otherwise, we are already lost, and we are already losing anyway. But anyhow, so that's my point. The same is in politics. The same is in politics. So that's a discussion that I think bishops are not having. We already lost. The war is lost. And so we try to circumvent and try to energize from our own places. That's my point. I know that it's a long discussion, but I think it's central, or should be central, to the bishop.
Yeah, so I would, a couple points there is one, the first thing I would say is, I don't think our vision is fatalist or that the public square or that public education is irredeemable or that can't be reformed. Obviously, there's deep philosophical roots and questions and problems about the modern education system, primarily as it's, come out of, sort of the John Dewey thinking in philosophy of education and the pragmatism that underlies that idea, or the industrialism that underlies sort of a modern education system, and how can we educate the human person to something greater, like the classical liberal arts tradition provides, that is, that our Catholic schools are seeking to form children in. So I think there's a lot of questions there. For us as a Catholic conference, our role over the year, we're a pretty small staff, so we can't, we have a lot of big issues that we try to tackle. We try to work on things like healthcare and education, and any number of other issues, criminal justice reform. And, we try to do those things with 2 or 3 staff members if we're lucky. Some Catholic conferences are just a one-man band, with the drum and the cymbal and the monkey, and they're trying to do all of these things. And so we can only cover so much ground given the staffing and the resources we have. And so I think one place where we've found it important to have a conversation is on the school choice issue, because the school choice issue isn't about trying to recognize that the public square or the public education is irredeemable or can't be reformed or anything of that nature, but it's recognizing that we need to reestablish as a fundamental public truth that parents are the primary educators of their children. Once we can get that right, I think we can start talking about a lot of other education topics and a lot of other education reform issues. But we need to primarily recognize that the parent is the driver of that child's education, and the state has a responsibility, because the parent has a right, so therefore the state has a duty and a responsibility to assist parents in achieving that educational opportunity for their child. That is a basic truth, and that's not a truth. That's not something we do because the public education system's a problem or the public square's a mess. We do that because that's just a basic truth. And so we are trying to implement that basic truth through public policy ideas so that parents have an opportunity to get their kid where they think their education would be best suited for the child. So I think that's important to recognize there. But I think you raise very good questions, very deep questions, very complex questions. And I think there is still a question of how does the church speak up and speak out on the formation of our young people during their K through 12 education. I can tell you, as somebody who deals with the legislature all the time, they are constantly talking about career readiness and sort of workforce development of children. And I just think that is rooted in a John Dewey modern idea, industrial idea of what education is for. Education is no longer about the formation of the person. It's no longer even about creating a person who's going to be civically minded to be a good citizen. It's about how do we get this person into the workforce so that we can increase the GDP of the nation, and we can make them sort of a cog in the wheel, basically, of industry. And that is totally a problematic view and vision of education and of the human person. And I think there's a lot of conversation to be had there. And I would agree, Mario, that we've got a lot of work to do as a church to help communicate a broader vision of education so that we can help form people to see something different. And I think COVID, to keep ranting myself, I think COVID actually did a lot to help open up the eyes of a lot of parents. I know parents who, when they had to home educate, right, and they were like, wait a minute, my kid's learning this, or they're learning this for this purpose, and they realized, wait a minute, isn't there something better out there for them, or isn't there something greater? And I know I've seen other parents who decided to switch to some sort of different educational model. Maybe it was a classical educational model, and they sit there and they go, why did nobody tell me about this as a kid? Why didn't I get this when I was in K through 12? I thought that when I went to college and to seminary, and I go, wait a minute, philosophy, Homer, Aristotle, who are these people, and why didn't I learn about them, or why wasn't I reading these books, during my K through 12 education experience? And I think because there's an underlying issue of vision about what education is and what it is for. So yeah, that's a big conversation we need to be having. And I think we try to do that, and we try to form our legislators to the extent that we can on that topic, but within the limited resources and structures that we have.
Thank you. Valerie, you should ask all the rest of the questions.
There you go.
There's a filibuster going on the part of the gentleman, semi-gentleman. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I think that, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that the average Catholic in the pew isn't super aware of Catholic conferences and what is the history, what is the context, what is the role, and specifically as an executive director, I'm curious what your daily grind is, or your rhythms through the weeks, through the year, months, and through the year, but I do think a lot of people, and some people might even think it's crossing over, like it's out overstepping our bounds as people of faith or as the church to get so involved in legislation, for example. So can you give us some context about that, about what the Catholic conferences are, a little bit about their history, and kind of how they interact with both the hierarchy of the church, the magisterium, the people in the pews, and the general public?
Yeah, so let's see here where to start. So I think it's very important. So when in our work, when I talk to lay people about the work of the Catholic Conference, or frankly, even our priests and our clergy members, I tell them, look, you either know about the Catholic Conference or you have no idea about the Catholic Conference. And there's really not, excuse me, there's really not an in-between. There's not a bunch of people out there going, oh yeah, I know a little bit about the Nebraska Catholic Conference, but not a whole lot. Again, you either know about us or you don't know about us. And so how can we get you into the binary of knowing about us? Because there's nothing really in between. But once people know about us, I think they're very thankful and very grateful for the work that we're doing, because we really have kind of our mission statement is to essentially engage and educate and equip public officials, the Catholic faithful, and then the general public. And so primarily our audience is to work with elected officials, usually people like state legislators or the governor or the attorney general or our federal congressional delegation. Like they're our primary audience as a Catholic conference. That's just who our mission is directed toward. And I would say more secondarily, our mission is oriented toward educating the laity on what's going on in state government, and how can they be educated, equipped, and basically engaged in the work of state government. And so, at the Catholic Conference here, again, we're a small team, but we do have two people who work on communications and outreach, and their work is really outward facing, not only to the general public, but more primarily here to the Catholic laity. Their role is to try to communicate as much as possible to the people who belong to our network. So we have thousands of Catholics across the state who belong to our network. And then we obviously try to tap into our parishes, through our priests and deacons and through our professional lay staff who work within a Catholic church setting. I always tell people the Catholic Conference doesn't have a middleman in office. We need middlemen out in the pews. We need somebody to basically get our message down to Joe and Jane Doe pew sitter. So I always tell our priests, I tell our faith formation people, like, you are very critical for taking our message and getting it down to the people. So, for example, right now we are working on we're working on 2 major ballot initiatives related to the abortion issue here in Nebraska. And we've got all sorts of material that we're trying to use to help educate Catholics. So we're going out and giving parish presentations across the state of Nebraska, but we're also trying to get more information to just the general people who don't show up to a Wednesday night parish presentation. And so we really rely on our parishes to be sort of the distributors of that information. So it's an ongoing hard job as you all know, for anybody in communications. How do I get my message to the intended audience? And we're always wrestling with that. But at the end of the day, we're a bishops' conference. And so we as a staff are assisting our bishops in their responsibility to teach, to sanctify, and to govern their dioceses, and to form the people of God in the faith, including in their social responsibility to engage in the political sphere. And in that regard, the work of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on faithful citizenship, I think, has been very important and helpful in that regard. I think of Pope Francis saying that, that we must meddle in politics, right? He doesn't mince words in that regard. We need to meddle in politics as Catholics. Also, he and Pope Benedict both have said that the church has a responsibility to be involved in politics, that we have to get off of the sidelines in the fight for justice, right? Because politics belongs to the realm of justice and charity and other things of that nature. And so we have a role and responsibility to be involved in those areas. And in particular, I tell our lay people that the bishop's role is to help educate and guide them in matters of faith and morals. But at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the laity to go into the world of politics and to transform the everyday sphere of the temporal life, which includes political life. And so we remind them that, don't always just look at the bishops and say, well, the bishop isn't doing this on this issue or that political issue or that political issue. Our response is, we're trying to form you in your faith and morals. Now it's your responsibility to get engaged in the political process so that you can be leaven, that you can be salt, that you can be light in that political world, because it's the laity who are primarily responsible for the evangelization and the work of spreading the gospel in those everyday circumstances. So it's a beautiful, obviously a co-responsibility, between the bishops and the laity, but it's hard work. And how do we form people to engage in that way? That's an ongoing, task and problem and in labor of love, for the church. So, and we're dealing with that every day, and we love it, even though it's a struggle.
And that's probably just the point at which you tell them about the American Solidarity Party.
Careful, Jim.
There you go.
Go ahead, Valerie, go ahead.
No, I do want to thank you, Tom, for the work you're doing. And, do you have any thoughts about people who would say that we are out of bounds, that the church is out of bounds by directly engaging so much the legislature, the process, the political process?
Yeah. So, there's different people who might make that claim. You might get a Catholic who makes that claim. And usually to Catholics, because we can talk to them, from the richness of our tradition. It's just a matter, I think, of taking a moment to catechize them and to evangelize to them about the call of our baptism, and that the call of our baptism is to be involved in everything and to sanctify everything. nobody would say something like, well, you shouldn't bring your faith life into the family. It would be like, what are you talking about? That's an artificial distinction to say that faith doesn't belong in the family. In a like manner, it's an artificial distinction to say that our faith doesn't have a place in politics. So I think obviously in an age where we have a growing secularism and this idea that the church shouldn't be involved with the state, et cetera, and false notions of what that means, I think it's a matter of helping people recognize, Catholics in particular, first, hey, here's why we have a role in politics. Here's why we have a role of bringing our principles and our morals and our faith to bear in the public square. I always tell people, look, if you're not bringing your values to the public square, somebody else is going to bring their values to the public square. So we have first principles for how we think society ought to be ordered. And John Dewey has first principles for how he thinks society ought to be ordered. And so does John Locke. And so does Joe and Jane Smith. Everybody has first principles for how they think society ought to be ordered. And we have a responsibility and, frankly, a right and a freedom to bring our values and our first principles into the public square to articulate those. So I think that's also something I would tell sort of maybe the person who isn't Catholic, who's sort of saying, this is a church state violation or something of that nature. I would say, hey, you're bringing your first principles to bear in the public square. Those are philosophical principles, and frankly, they're theological principles. They're principles about the meaning of life and the totality of existence. So whether it's about speeding, what the law should be on speeding, or what the law should be on taxes, or what the law should be on abortion or education or helping the poor, those are all philosophical, political, and even theological views. So the question is, how can we bring those views to the public square? And in our democratic and pluralistic setting, how can we work to implement what is best for the common good? And so I think that's a vision I think I probably would lay out to people who make that claim, and kind of go from there. If they continue to disagree, then I suppose it is what it is, but hopefully that's an opportunity to help persuade them to see, at the very least, why we think it's important to be involved. Now, if they want to bring it from a legal angle, then we just say, you just misunderstand the law, because the law certainly allows houses of worship in religious denominations and what have you to be involved in the political process. Obviously, there's certain limitations if you're a certain type of legal corporation, like a 501c3 doesn't get involved in the endorsement of candidates or political parties or things of that nature. So those are things that we stay away from, right? But otherwise, there's many reasons to be involved, and those are some of the things I would argue in that kind of a situation.
One last question, Valerie.
How can people who are hearing you get more engaged with what you're doing and be a part of it?
Yeah, so if somebody's very interested in following the work of the Nebraska Catholic Conference, we have a website. It's necatholic.org. That's letter N, letter E for Nebraska. necatholic.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. They can kind of follow our work there. We have like a network. We call it the Catholic Advocacy Network of Nebraska. So people can sign up for that network. They can sort of stay up to date and engaged with what we're doing. But if you're from another state, you're listening in, and you're from Minnesota or California or Florida or what have you, you have a Catholic conference in your state. So look up Florida Catholic Conference or New York Catholic Conference or Hawaii Catholic Conference. There's like probably only a couple states that don't have a Catholic conference. So look up your Catholic conference and get engaged with them. Maybe they're a one-person operation. Maybe they have 5 people on their team. Who knows? But in either circumstance, they're doing similar work to us, which is to equip and educate and engage with their elected officials, their Catholic laity and their Catholic faithful, and also with the general public. And so get connected with their work. Also get connected with the work of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're doing the same kind of work, but at the federal level with our congressional officials and with people like the President of the United States, and following more closely, actions and work of the Supreme Court of the United States. And so follow their work as well, particularly as we're coming up in an election cycle. I said the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has their Faithful Citizenship Initiative, which is a great way to just be fundamentally formed as a Catholic. What does it mean for me to have a Catholic vision of political and social life? And their document on faithful citizenship, I think, is a great synopsis of that. And so I think those are a variety of different ways to engage specifically with our work, or if you're in a different state, with the work of your local Catholic conference. But otherwise, my takeaway is just be out there having charitable, respectful dialogue on these issues. That's really critical. And in a time and place where political conversation it can be very toxic or divisive or tribal, or you just, whatever my political party says, I'm going to identify with, come hell or high water. We have a responsibility as Catholics to have conversations that are charitable, that are winsome, that are engaging, that respect the human person, so that at the very least, even if somebody doesn't agree with us, they can say, wow, that's a person who has witnessed to the life of charity in the way that they talk and they communicate and they engage. And so I think that's really important, no matter what we're doing, whether we're in Nebraska, California, Canada, wherever you're at in the world, we have a way to guide us in our formation of the political order in our conversations with our neighbors and our friends and our strangers and even our enemies. So anyhow, I'll leave you kind of with those thoughts.
Our first principle, we know, is the person of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So we always end with the gospel for the day, and this is taken from Mark. The disciples were on the way going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus went ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him, spit upon him, scourge him, and put him to death. But after 3 days he will rise. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. He replied, What do you wish me to do for you? They answered him, Grant that in your glory we may sit, one at your right and the other at your left. Jesus said to them, You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the chalice that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? They said to him, We can. Jesus said to them, The chalice that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. When the 10 heard this, they became indignant at James and John. Jesus summoned them and said to them, You know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
That was a very beautiful ending. Thank you so much for this opportunity to have this discussion.
Thanks again for joining us and for the work you're doing and your
Thank
staff.
you.
One last question, Tom. Have you ever heard of somebody named Epimenides?
I don't think so.
Epimenides the Cretan said that all Cretans are liars. cited by none other than Paul. Well, we know this. You know that's a paradox. I have a legitimate friend who has written at great length on what he calls the liar paradox.
There you go.
So,
all right.
What is your point?
There doesn't have to be a point. I just want to make a connection with Crete. I mean, how often do we have anybody from Crete on this show? Never.
Oh, Crete.
Crete, Nebraska. So at least I only went to school there and I didn't live there, so I can't be from there. So
Well, how did you come to be there in school?
well, it's just a small town in Nebraska. It's just a small town with a kind of a liberal arts college there. So it's
Oh my
islanded.
gosh!
Not the real Crete. So
Oh
not
my
the Crete
gosh!
Okay.
Now, what was that philosopher's name? Herb Dewey? Was it Herb Dewey? Oh,
Close enough.
wow! I was totally way. The
I had to go.
who asked me what my
Okay.
point was.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, gentlemen.
You bet. Take care. Thank you. God bless
Bye.
you all.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.